Welcome, everyone, to the American Bar Association General Practice Solo and Small Firm Division, our next Activate Diversity series. And today's topic is Activate Diversity, Unity in Diversity, Challenging Anti-Semitism Through Dialogue. I want to thank, first of all, the people who are responsible for putting this together today. I want to start with our staff, Kim Koshian, Steve Wilde, Sherry Napier, and Molly Hess for a fine job they're doing. And also, I want to give some thanks to our diversity director, Kelly Adams, and also the chair of our diversity board, Chisa Putman, for putting this together. For those of you, American Bar Association General Practice Solo and Small Firm Division is the third largest division of the American Bar Association. We have approximately 25,000 to 26,000 members, and our motto is "Your success is our mission." And what we try to do in our division is we try to advocate for the improvement of our administration of justice and to make sure that America's solo and small firm practitioners are more efficient, more successful, and more profitable. And this topic today is we're all just so excited to present it today because it hits on all of those cylinders. And we're talking about increasing our dialogue. You cannot have successful practice in any business unless you can talk civilly on controversial topics. And also, I like to, as far as society is concerned, I like to say that, our country was founded on the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look at one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, it states right in there, all people are created equal. In the 14th Amendment, all persons are entitled to equal protection and due process. Quite frankly, you cannot get more diverse, more inclusive than the word all, and more equal than the word all. That's what it is. But now, with those words, our words have not always matched our actions in this country. And we've been on a 200 and approximately 48-year exercise to match our words with our actions. And those of you who cherish DEI, cherish the American values of equality and justice for all, know that there comes times when we must talk civilly with each other on controversial topics. And that's what we're here to do today, to bring each other together. Words hold power. In today's geopolitical climate, certain phrases, especially those related to Israel and to the Jewish people, can unintentionally cause harm and lead to violence. This program today aims to shed light on the interpretation of some common phrases we are hearing today and how to encourage effective dialogue to foster mutual understanding. In addressing some of the anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes that Jewish people face, especially in today's charged political climate, this program will provide concrete takeaways to activate action towards combating anti-Semitism in an effort to advance respectful dialogue. And please remember, as with all of the topics that we do on our Activate Diversity series, our topics are meant to spark meaningful conversation and change. And so please be polite. I will introduce the moderators. The moderators will introduce this esteemed panel today, and we will get this program underway. First, I want to thank Jamie Boston, a member of the Executive Council of GP Solo. Attorney Boston is an associate counsel for the Office of General Law in the United States Patent and Trademark Office in Alexandria, Virginia. Prior to that, he served as an assistant attorney general for the state of Maryland in the Organized Crime Unit. He is a 2000 graduate of the Washington College of Law and received his bachelor's degree from Johns Hopkins University. Upon graduation, Attorney Boston served as chief of the criminal law for the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea. Prior to his Army career, Boston was an intern at the White House, an intern student law clerk for June L. Green of the U.S. District Court of District Columbia. Please welcome Jamie Boston. The other moderator, H. Nicole Workmeister. She has more than 30 years of experience in civil litigation in New Mexico, with an emphasis on civil rights, employment, medical malpractice, and tort disputes involving state, county, and governmental entities and officials. She is our former membership chair and also a chair of the GP Solo Executive Council. She is a undergraduate. She obtained her undergraduate degree from Colby College and her Juris Doctorate from Boston College. And with that said, I'll now turn it over, and please welcome Nicole Workmeister. And with that said, I'll now turn it over to Attorney Workmeister and Attorney Boston. Thank you. Enjoy the conversation.
Thanks, Chair Hamilton. You've been an excellent leader, and just thank you for the support on behalf of the Diversity Board and just what you've done for the division as a whole. Welcome, everybody. And I think Henry kind of said it. We recognize this could potentially be or is a controversial subject. But to give you a little history on the Activate Diversity series, myself, Kelly Adams, who you heard her name mentioned earlier, and several others started this series, I guess 3, maybe 4 years ago now. And the whole idea is that, we believe in dialogue, which, as you see in the reading that Henry just gave you. Where are we going to, how are we going to move forward if we don't take the time to have some of these uncomfortable conversations? And so I recognize this is a touchy subject. I don't think it'll go off the rails, but if it does, remember to be respectful. The views here are expressed not of ourselves individually. I have to take this second to give my little disclaimer, since I am a fellow employee. I don't represent the government. I'm a retired JAG. I don't rep the U.S. military. And some of the questions that might be asked may not even be from our viewpoints, but just we recognize that there are things out there that people want to hear about and talk about. The focus in this particular session is anti-Semitism, recognizing that there are many viewpoints and perspectives related to this issue. We are going to explore some of them, but we may not do it in the whole, in a complete manner as we'd hope, because we just don't have the time. But I think it's going to be an excellent panel. These people are experts, they're engaging. And so I hope you all engage us or engage the panelists and ask questions. So get your pad and paper out, write them down so you don't forget them, so you can write them into the chat. And just want to welcome all of you. And this time I'll turn it over to one of my favorite colleagues, Ms. Nicole Workmeister.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And thank you to all the panelists for being here. The bios of all the panelists are posted, and we are not going to spend a long time going through all the bios because it would take up the entire program. We have some very esteemed panelists with us today. I am going to start out with Scott Levin, and I just want to mention a couple of things about his background because he has a big ADL background, which stands for the Anti-Defamation League. So Mr. Levin is the Mountain States Regional Director of the ADL since 2010, after a successful career as a trial lawyer. And for those of you who are not familiar with ADL, ADL's mission is not just related to combating anti-Semitism or crimes against Jewish people, but the mission is also to secure justice and fair treatment for all. And ADL has been very active in fighting all forms of prejudice to ensure a just and inclusive society for all. So with that, I want to turn to Mr. Levin to provide a framework for our conversation this afternoon about anti-Semitism. ADL compiles a lot of statistics about anti-Semitism and hate crimes. And looking this morning, for example, I can see there's been a nearly 360% increase in hate crimes against Jews since October 7th. But statistics aside for a second, because they're important, but they're very impersonal. In talking personally to Jews around the country, there's this sense I've gotten about a vulnerability that I'm not sure I've seen before, at least in my generation. For me, when I look at some of the anti-Jewish acts, even in just the past few weeks, they're reminiscent of 1930s Germany. And I know that sounds very melodramatic, possibly, but we're talking about vandalizing of Jewish stores and signs on businesses excluding Jews, student groups on campuses like Berkeley Law School denying membership to Jewish students who support Israel, a murder, actual assaults against people who look Jewish. There's been nearly 300 bomb threats to synagogues in the past few weeks alone in this country. Sometimes I feel like the only thing that's preventing another Holocaust is the existence of Israel, and that the only difference between then and now is that that the Jewish people have a state. So I want to ask you, Mr. Levin, could you start off framing the issue of anti-Semitism in terms of not just the statistics, which, as I said, are important, but also this feeling of vulnerability that Jews have today in terms of our personal safety, and even more existentially in terms of survival as a people?
Sure. And first, I just want to very much thank the American Bar Association and the Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division, to you, Nicole and Jamie, for all of the great work that you are doing. And what a privilege it is to be here today with this esteemed panel. And I think one of the things that I wanted to start with was something that Mr. Hamilton referred to when he said that we really have as a founding document the Declaration of Independence and what it means. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we're coming into Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday weekend and what that means. And at this time, because I'm asked to speak in various places, I always reread the I Have a Dream speech. And, one of the parts that's not quoted a lot about is that Reverend King referred to the blank check, the promissory note that was written by the Declaration of Independence that had yet to be cashed. And I think, sadly, here we are that we're still this many years later, and we're still looking to be able to cash that promissory note. I think that one of the areas that people don't always recognize is that in this diverse country that we have, that we are diverse in so many different ways. Certainly color, certainly sexual identity and orientation, but also religion, among other things, ethnicities, races, all of those things that come into play. And what we have found of late is that people have not always thought of anti-Semitism in that same grouping, in that same way that the hate crimes and that the hateful acts have taken place. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, but I think where we have to start in this, Nicole, is with really how we define what is anti-Semitism. And there's lots of different definitions for it. One of them that's used a lot these days is the IRO working definition. And it says simply that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And so to break that down just simply, anti-Semitism at its heart is Jew hatred that goes on. And it can be used because people can use rhetorical type statements in the names that are used or the way that stereotypes are about the perception of Jews. They can foist them towards other people. There's a laundry list of tropes that Jews have faced throughout history, from the killing of Jesus Christ to the belief that Jews control all financial institutions, that they're cheap or miserly or whatever. So they can be directed towards me as a Jewish person, for sure, but sometimes they can be done to other people. In the same way, epithets against other groups are sometimes used just based on these terrible stereotypes that occur. But I think, again, the simplest way to look at all of this is that anti-Semitism today is Jew hatred. And like all forms of bias, incidents can be anti-Semitic both in their intent and in their effect. I think just as we ask people to understand that when they are making comments that they might write off as a joke or some common idiom, and they don't have any ill intent with that. The impact is really how we measure all of these things, whether it's against religion, race, ethnicity, orientation, identity, any of those kinds of things. When it comes to anti-Semitism, though, I do want to point out that it is really a conspiracy theory at its heart, and it's a very irrational one at that. You know, over our very brief history that we've been in the United States of America, Jews have been hated because they're too liberal or because they're too conservative, because they're lazy and inferior, or because they're dominating and want to take over of what it's done. They're pacifists, they're warmongers, they're capitalists, they're communists. They're too cheap, they're too spendthrift. It doesn't matter. It's an irrational conspiracy theory that's gone against them, because at its hate, there is this hate, at its center is this hatred of Jewish people. And like I said, there are certain tropes that have gone through history that have been levied against Jewish people. Unfortunately, they were categorized at the beginning of the 19th century. One book or writing that many people may have heard of is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was just a conspiratorial, made-up fake document by the Tsarist police at the time of a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. And in it, it really has the basis of so many of these things, from deicide, the killing of Christ, to the blood libels that Jews are responsible back in the Middle Ages for spiriting away healthy young Gentile children and bloodletting them to put their blood in to make the matzah. Crazy stuff. But today, these things still come forward as Jews are blamed for everything from poisoning wells to causing COVID that's going on. There's disloyalty. And I will state here and now, and I don't mean to speak for everybody, but I think I speak for most of us, that as a Jew, I'm an American. I may have an affinity towards the state of Israel. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little less than an Irish person might have towards Ireland, or an African person might have towards Africa, or a Spanish person towards Spain, Mexican towards Mexico, whatever it is. I do have an affinity for that, but that's not a disloyalty or a dual loyalty to my commitment to the United States of America. Other forms of anti-Semitism that we see are the denial of the Holocaust, that it didn't happen. And this denialism we're seeing in modern ways today too, for instance, and I'll talk a bit more about it in a few minutes, but the denial of what happened on October 7th, or the being able to come up with conspiracy theories of who to blame, the victim or the perpetrator that's there. But also anti-Semitism as it relates to the Holocaust can just be abuse of the Holocaust, where, as we all know, in arguments, if someone doesn't have anything else to argue, they compare the person to Hitler, or they compare the situation to the Holocaust. And I'll state clearly, that can be anti-Semitic, because nothing compares to the Holocaust but the Holocaust that's there. As Nicole said, we can be worried that we might be re-entering into those times, but to call someone Hitler or to say that they are a perpetrator of the Holocaust is very difficult. Other tropes include the dishonesty, the power, the control, the greed, all of these things that throughout history, again, whether Jews were rich or poor, whether they were people in power or out of power, they've been used against Jews. And there are things that I think we all have to be mindful, as Mr. Boston said, with the language that we use, that we don't fall into those traps. Another thing that I just want to point out is I think that in this day and age, every faith-based institution has to be concerned about security that's going on, whether it's the Mother Emanuel Church for what happened there, or the Tree of Life synagogue that's happened, or the mosques that have been certainly under attack of it. But I want to let you know that for many years now, while every faith institution has upped their security, none have done more so or had to do more so than synagogues and temples. And it's a very sad thing that today, if you were to go visit in your neighborhoods or in your communities, most of synagogues and temples, there'll be a sheriff's or a police department vehicle out in front of it, or there'll be hired security that's there. And it's a very sad thing. And this was before October 7th. I want to make that very, very clear. This is the trend that we've been facing. And like all forms of hate over the past decade, they have been going up and up and up. And from ADL, one of the things that we do is that we track anti-Semitic incidents so that we can look how they are year over year. Do we capture all of them? No. Do we, does everybody report into us? No. But we're able, through our processes and working with law enforcement, with the media, and because people can contact any one of our 24 offices across the country when there are incidents that are taking place, we're able to compare apples to apples, if you will, so that we can see trends. I've been at the Anti-Defamation League for 13 years. When I first came to the ADL as a professional, we had 9 or 10 anti-Semitic incidents that were taking place in Colorado, where I'm based. Right now, and maybe we had 15 to 25 calls total that would be for racism and homophobia and other forms of hate that's out there. Last year, we had over 700 calls to our office. It's been just extraordinary. Anti-Semitic incidents, as Nicole just reported, have gone up 361% year over year just in the 3-month period since October the 7th to January the 7th that's there. Over time, we've seen this. Every year we talk about this new historic rate that's been increased. And I just thought I'd give you just a few figures across the country of what we've seen. In 2013, across the country, from coast to coast, 751. In 2017, that climbed up to almost 2,000 at 1,986. In 2022, we saw about 3,697 incidents. In just that 3-month period I was talking about, 3,283. So in other words, in a 3-month period of time, we hit what was almost a full year's historic number in 2022. And these aren't all kinds of incidents that take place. It's the stuff that people say and do to each other, the language that they use. I've seen more swastikas since I've come to work at the Anti-Defamation League than anyone should have to see in a lifetime, I think. But it's also vandalism, assaults, harassment, all of these things. And an unfortunate amount of them have taken place in schools. And that's why we work so hard on anti-bias of all sorts to try to improve and make more respectful school climates that are going on. Now, I want to tell you that on October the 6th, at that point in time, seeing the way the trend was going, we were already heading into another terribly high number of anti-Semitic incidents that we had seen. And it was going to be within, I'm sure, the top 1, 2, or 3 years worth of anti-Semitic incidents. October 7th just radically changed things. Since that point in time, the amount of incidents that have come in has been just extraordinary. And, not all of them are directed specific to what's going on in Israel and Gaza and with the Palestinian people or with Hamas that's going on. It's just there's been a floodgate that's been open as if there was some sort of permission given for people to use the kind of hateful language and hateful symbols and actions that they've been doing. So I wanted to just address, because it is sort of the thing that's in the room right now, of how do we look at these things and what is anti-Semitic about what's going on since then. I will tell you one of the most troubling things that I had is that on October 7th, as we first learned of the barbaric attacks that had taken place and just the nature and how horrible it was, there were already rallies that were being organized to oppose Israel before Israel had really organized to be able to fire a weapon back that was going on. And that was a bit of a tip-off to me of what was going to be coming. And I think that what's been hard at this point in time is that words matter, and that there's been just a bit of a breakdown of what words actually mean. So two in particular, and I could go through a long list, but two in particular that I think might be worth our discussion today is, one of them is Zionism, because it has taken on a meaning that I think is beyond what Zionism was actually created and used for. Zionism is really merely that the Jewish people have a right to a land of self-determination, and that they have that in their ancestral homeland, in the land of Israel. And that was a dream that was held by Jewish people for several millennium because of their relationship, and because there's been a thread of people that have been living in this land for several thousand years. What's happened today, though, is I to this group, I can say this because of the interest of this organization. It's taken on meanings in the same way for those of us that understand what the words critical race theory means. It does not mean everything that you oppose about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's being used by many people wrongly to in a negative way. And I think that Zionism today has been taken on by people that oppose settlements, that oppose the Netanyahu government, the policies of Israel, those kinds of things. And I will tell you that personally and as an organization, criticism of the policies of Israel is not anti-Semitism. We can discuss what would be the best way for Israel to do this, that, or the other thing, including prosecuting the war that's going on right now with the terrorist organization Hamas. But what's happened is Zionism has come to be a stand-in for those that oppose so many different things. I may be in a losing battle, but I want to make sure people at least understand what it was meant to be. Another one, which again, to lawyers should understand, words like genocide. Genocide has a legal meaning. It's a definition. It's in the United Nations, has a specific charter that relates to it, that talks about an intent to essentially annihilate and remove an entire people and to kill them and destroy them. And I don't, again, you can argue about many different things that relate to what's happening or has happened, but that's not what's going on. And I know at the International World Court, as a matter of fact, there's actually a case that's going to go on, and hopefully, Israel does not typically participate in the cases that are brought there, but it is in this one because I think it's important to recognize, again, that words have meaning and to, as we all know, have legal definitions that should be employed in what's there. I guess one final thing, which I will say, which is going on today in the world of anti-Semitism, especially you hear it in the rallies that are going on, is what do the words, for instance, Free Palestine mean? And some people, it lands on different people's ears in different ways. And as I understand it and I interpret it, Free Palestine is a shorthand for Free Palestine from the river to the sea. And a lot of people don't know what river and what sea we're talking about, but we're talking about on one side the Jordan River and on the other the Mediterranean. And if there is no Jewish existence that exists and the Jews are removed between those two bodies of water, there is no Jewish homeland, there are no Jews, there is no Israel. And so that delegitimization of Israel is something that has become extraordinarily difficult for Jews that's going on. Israel as a country was created, again, you may not like it, I do, but you may not. It's legal. It was created and it's been around for 75 years. It's not going to go away willingly. and my organization is a two-state solution, and we hope that there will be lands of self-determination for both the Jewish and the Palestinian people where they can live side by side, safe and secure. But with what's going on today, with this rise in anti-Semitism that's happened, now with what's happening specific to this Israel-Hamas war that's going on, all of that with increasing rallies and calls, the use of language that we wouldn't think is necessarily acceptable that's there. As Nicole referred to, there's a certain vulnerability that most Jews haven't felt in a very long time. And I'll just leave you with the final thought, which is that, again, part of this is this irrationality of anti-Semitism. Today, it may seem, and we're going to learn more about this as we talk, but it may seem that Jews have a certain position of influence or maybe even some affluence that's going on. And it's hard to understand, how can there still be hatred against them when they're so privileged in other ways? And the reality is that we're seeing it today as more and more anti-Semitic incidents are happening, irrespective of any influence, irrespective of any affluence that Jews may have. So thank you very much again for having me here today.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Levin, for providing that context. Very helpful. And let me turn to you, Rabbi Enger. And again, let me just give a quick information about your background, not to repeat everything on the bio that is on the link in the chat, but you are an ordained rabbi, and you've not only been a spiritual leader as head of a synagogue, but also a lay leader, directing a program at the Faith Trust Institute, which is a multi-faith organization working to end sexual and domestic violence around the world, and directing a rabbinical organization to advance equity in the rabbinic search and hiring process. I wanted to pick up on something Scott said and ask you about one of the narratives that Jewish people or many Jewish people view as anti-Semitic, and that's the narrative of Jews as newcomers to Israel, the land that's now Israel, or Jews as colonizers. From a liturgical perspective, as a spiritual leader, and also from a historical perspective, could you give us some context about that narrative?
Sure. And first, I want to echo what Scott said of gratitude to the American Bar Association and the Solo Small Firm and General Practice Division, to Nicole Werkheimer and Jamie Boston as well. Thank you so much for planning and coordinating this important gathering and for the opportunity to participate. Before I answer, I want to do something for me that I hope also will perhaps be an invitation for you to join me. And that's just to quiet for a moment. We just heard a lot of important sharing from Scott Levin. And I want to reconnect, ground myself. And again, the invitation is for you to ground and maybe to drop down into our hearts. And as difficult as it is on Zoom in general, and all the more so that you can see me on a screen and hear me, but I can't even see you, but I know that you're out there and listening. And we'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about activating diversity, but I think this activating these invisible but very real energetic lines of connection with all of us human beings. I say that from a Jewish spiritual perspective. It crosses the lines of many, many spiritual traditions as well. But we are all connected, and to activate that connectivity with the grounding of the divine, however we understand it, I want that to lead me in my responses. So with that, and with the slowing down and gratitude for permission to do that moment of practice, I do want to move into the complex and challenging question that you offer, Nicole. So we do hear, and we have heard for a number of years, though I think that the volume has picked up on this sense of decolonizing the land that some call Israel, some call Palestine. We can even go back further, call it Canaan, Canaan, the land of Israel, and also in biblical times called Zion itself. And touching and elaborating on what Scott had mentioned of a 3,000 plus year deep connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And actually, I want to, in moving forward in that, I think it might even be helpful as we move forward in the conversation and to wrestle in a way with why is this challenging all these years later. I think one of the challenges is the complexity, not only of the topic of Jew hatred, but really the question of well, what or who is a Jew, and that I think that complexity adds to the challenge. So when we're speaking of who is a Jew or what is a Jew, we are speaking about a people. There is the Jewish people. Judaism is a religion as well. When we speak about Jewish tradition, we are talking about a history. We're talking about a civilization. We're talking about culture, and that would be in the plural as well. It's multiple cultures. We're talking about community. A person is Jewish either by birth or by completing a recognized process of conversion. So people are born in the Jewish people, and people join the Jewish people through conversion, those who choose. To be a Jew, to be part of the Jewish people is not limited to a particular location. There's not a particular skin color of Jews. Jews are of all skin colors. Judaism, to be a Jew, is not a particular ethnicity. There are multiple ethnicities, and that's been true over time. The Jewish people were born in the land of Israel. We look back to Abraham in the biblical text, who was considered the first Jew, though he would have been called at that point an Ivri, a Hebrew, which literally means one who crosses over. And that crossing over, he made a number of crossings over geographically, but really it was a crossing over into an idea that there was one God, the oneness of God, and that God was not tangible or visible, that it was much more of an energy calling Abraham and then those who came after into relationship, a particular type of a relationship, a covenantal relationship, rooted in land, the land of Israel, and for a purpose. And that purpose was to partner with the divine for healing, for renewal, for wholeness in the world. And not just for the Jewish people. That's central to Judaism and Jewish belief is the core value and belief that every human being is created with a spark of the divine, in the divine image, in Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, precious and unique. Let me share a little bit about the deep connection from biblical times onward. As was mentioned, there has been a consistent Jewish presence in the land of Israel since biblical times, though there was also the traumatic experience of destruction of both the first and then the second temple. The destruction of the second temple in the year 70 by Rome resulted in exile, and that exile was much more complete in the year 135 of the Common Era. As Nicole mentioned, that was not the end of the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel, that through daily liturgy, in daily prayers, there has been for 1,500, 1,600 years at least, the prayer for return to Zion. In holidays, there is always the next year in Jerusalem, the wish for a return to the land of Israel. And that continued, I would call it a religious Zionism, a liturgical Zionism, a spiritual Zionism has been always the case in the Jewish people since the year 70 and the year 135, when sovereignty ended by Rome in 70. That continued through various meanderings, and meanderings really is a terrible word to use, so I want to take that back. It really was expulsion and exile and persecution in country after country after country. Something changed, though, with modernity and the rise of nationalism in the late 18th century and then into the 19th century. Something very important happened in France with the French Revolution in the late 19th century, and then in Germany a little bit later with what's known as emancipation. For the first time ever, Jewish people were allowed to become citizens in France and in Germany. And that was a turning point in many ways. It gave rise to Reform Judaism and a temporary shift in sense of the desire of return to Zion, where there was the thought that for momentarily, perhaps we actually will be able to be citizens whole and complete in Western European countries such as France and Germany. That changed drastically in the late 19th century with the Dreyfus Affair, where Captain Alfred Dreyfus was arrested, falsely convicted for treason, and Theodore Herzl and others at the time who felt that Western Europe perhaps would be a home, came to understand that the 2 millennia of anti-Semitism had not changed, that with pogrom, with exile, with inquisition, emancipation and citizenship still had not eradicated anti-Semitism. And at that point, while spiritual Zionism, religious Zionism, liturgical and festival Zionism had never stopped for 2,000 years, at that point in modernity, political Zionism was born and became a serious motivator, that anti-Semitism was not gone. In 1916, the land of Israel shifted from Ottoman Empire ruling to British Mandate rule. And in 1917, Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration that made real this possibility of saying that the land of Israel should be looked at and moved towards as a modern homeland for the Jewish people. The Holocaust changed everything. I won't talk at length for that, but the reality that had there been a state of Israel pre-1930 in the 1930s, that perhaps European Jewry would not have been eradicated by Hitler in the 1940s. In 1947, the United Nations offered and passed a resolution on a partition plan where the land of Israel would be divided into two nations, Palestine and Israel. Israel accepted, Palestinians declined. 1948, War of Independence, Israel did become a modern state. 1967, with the Six-Day War, where Israel was invaded by multiple countries but gained territory, really changed the landscape in the land of Israel, in that Israel gained territory with the hopes of returning it for recognition of statehood. Later, in 1978, that did happen with Egypt. The Sinai was returned. As we know, it has not happened yet with Gaza or the West Bank. And here we are now. So it's hurtful to hear and connect, or to hear an indictment that, as if a group of privileged Western, entirely white folk moved into the land of Israel to colonize it. That's disregards history on all levels.
Okay, well, I appreciate that context, and I want to give Jamie the opportunity to either follow up on anything that you've just related to us, Rabbi, or that Mr. Levin did in framing the issue of anti-Semitism, or to turn it over to Dr. Gordon.
Thanks, Nicole. I think I'm gonna go ahead with Dr. Gordon, and then, but we will circle back because I think there's some questions that all of you need to answer, or we like for you to answer. So we'll start with that. And so, as I kind of open up with, forgive me if I say anything that's incorrect or off. Please judge it, to my brain, not to my heart. But we promise to try to have a fair and open discussion here. That's our goal. And so now we're going to kind of get into some of the deeper questions, some of the things that are probably affecting us. We spent a lot of time, I saw this in the chat, we spent time on the framework and kind of the history for a reason, because there is a lot of history there, and we didn't even touch the iceberg, to be completely honest. There's other ethnicities, other peoples involved there, but again, as I kind of open up, we're faced on anti-Semitism here. But with that said, I'm going to turn to Dr. Gordon, because he's a man of history as well and can add even more context. And again, we're not going to spend time with the bio and all that. He's incredible. All right, that's all you need to know. I mean, he's I will say, board of trustee, distinguished professor in global affairs and department head at University of Connecticut. So I'm gonna leave it there, but you can read everything else about his magnificent career. And first, kind of the theme of what the rabbi spoke about and Mr. Levin, Professor Gordon, Dr. Gordon, just give a snippet of your background so people know about you.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and also Nicole, and also Rabbi Enger, and Scott Levin, and the community that is gathered for this meeting. I extend a shalom, Laila Tov, good evening, Vanakam, Otep, Assalamu alaikum, and Jijuich, and also Wanakisuk. And you're thinking, man, those are so many ways to say hello. But I ended with Wanakisuk because I'm in New England, and the Wampanoag people greeted the pilgrims, and Wanakisuk is Wampanoag, okay? Vanakam is Tamil, if you'd like to know, and the others you're familiar with. But to get to the point, to address what you just said, Jamie, I want to begin with an observation I made over the years, which is that wherever I've gone, and I've been all around this planet except for Antarctica, I've noticed that most people think their blacks are the blacks, their Jews are the Jews. And that's something very important to bear in mind, because people often, for a variety of reasons, use their context and exaggerate it, okay? So to one extent, they're talking about what they know, but to a lot of extent, they're also not talking about what they know, okay? Now, that's already with some people looking on the screen, if they're locked in a very narrow world of what Jews look like, they would look at me and not think in terms of the Jews. But where I'm from, I'm typical. And so they would look at the screen and they may look at some of the other Jews on the screen and may say, well, who are they? Are they Jewish? But it gets even more complicated, mainly because what I've found as I've traveled all over the world is I've seen every kind of Jew. And I generally have what's called good Judar, which is, and people always wonder, is that an essentialist thing? But what it is if you're a member of a community, you have a way of looking for little cues of people with whom you're connected. Say when Brazilians travel, they could spot Brazilians, even though Brazilians are multiracial. So in terms of myself, the kind of Jew I am, I'm born Jewish, and it halakhically so because of my, it's through my mother, but I'm not one of those people who have to say that it has to be exclusively through your mother. For me, if you have a Jewish parent, you know, and you identify with being Jewish, you're Jewish. My mother's father's family were from Jerusalem in the mid-19th century. And because they were from Jerusalem, they identified when they were asked as Palestinian Jews, but that was because they were outside of Jerusalem. They often added that they were Syrian and Ethiopians and Egyptians. And this is very important. That's a clue to why they were telling the truth, because at that time, if we think from the Ottoman Empire all the way through to the British Mandate, which Rabbi Enger brought up, when you are there, the area was called Southern Syria, and it was called Palestine. And the complicated part was, for many Jews who were there, it was called Erzatz Israel. And for when they were explaining to people outside of the area, they'll say they were Palestinian Jews. So that's what my mother's father's family were from. And the question about Palestinian Jews is even more complicated, mainly because many people don't know the history of the area. So for instance, in ancient Kemet, leading to ancient Egypt, it was Palest. The Romans call it Palestine, but they were referring not to the area, but to what is today Gaza. So it was along the beach, the Mediterranean areas there. It was actually after the destruction of the temple, and when Hadrian, in order to make it clear, he didn't want Jews to return, get those Jews out, the entire area was renamed Palestine, although it was a variety of areas, Judea, Samaria, a variety of groups, all the way through to Syria, okay? Now, my mother's family were also Jews. So my mother was Jewish on both sides. And again, to dispel stereotypes, if I say this, a lot of people, because I was born in the island of Jamaica, my mother's family were from Ireland, Shannon, Ireland, and they were Sephardic Jews from Ireland. But even if I say that, in people's heads, there'll be stereotypes. because there are stereotypes of what Irish people look like. And when I say Geojewish, that's actually Gaelic. That's Irish for hello. But even there, I saw a picture of my great-grandmother from Ireland. And I tell you, from my point of view, I mean, she looks like what I know Jewish people to look like, but she also, to me, looked like a Black woman. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind, because even though we talk about the many ways in which Jewish people are understood, the thing is we often project onto people in terms of what we expect them to look like by virtue of where they're from, okay? So some of the things that we should bear in mind is we should think about what is normal and what is abnormal. Because we're talking about bigotry, and a short way of thinking about bigotry is bigotry imposes abnormal conditions on normal life, and it pathologizes the normal, okay? So for instance, of course, in the island of Jamaica, a place that was under Spanish imperial rule, British imperial rule, and all kinds of other things, but also a highway through a variety of colonies, of course, the majority population of Jews there are going to look very different than the majority population of Jews, say, in the United States. And that's because in the United States, the vast majority of people who are Jews migrated from Europe. It's not that they weren't Jews from other places, but the vast majority are Jews from Europe. And because of that, it makes absolute sense where if you go to a meeting of Jews in the United States or in Canada, a lot of them are going to be light. But if you go to a meeting, for instance, I was asked to keynote the Association of Caribbean and Latin American Jews a decade ago on the island of Jamaica. I go there, and very few people were very light in the sense of what we'd call white. The vast majority were Jews who look like me, which totally makes sense, you see? When I was speaking at the American Jewish Association in Boston, I cracked up because, of course, I would be, in morphological terms, a minority there. But that makes sense. That's normal. But it'll be weird to go to Jamaica or Barbados and, or if you were to go to northern South Africa among the Lemba, and you expect to see a majority light population because they're Jews. That is already a distortion of Jewish people, okay? But these distortions have an effect because they have the effect not only of skewing what is normal and what is abnormal, but it also imposes double standards, you see? Because there are normal things people do. If people migrate to a country, for instance, they migrate because they want a better life. And they're going to fight their butt off to get a better life. So you see the catch-22. If they're successful, they're rebuked because it's considered abnormal for such people to be successful. If they fail, at the same time, that's almost celebrated when the whole idea was to have a better standard of life to begin with. But there are many other examples. So for instance, I know if I were to become rich, I'm from people who are poor, but if I were to become rich, I am going to make sure I use my money to affect political outcomes. I'm going to do what anybody else would do. And so if the double standard is to act like Jews who become rich are not supposed to do what rich people do. And similarly, if Jews are poor, not to do what poor people do, which is try to make sure you're no longer poor. So that's one of the first things to bear in mind, okay? Now, Scott was right on point. My actual position around anti-Semitism is very straightforward. I regard anti-Semitism as a racism. I write about it in my papers, in my books, etc. And to understand that, one has to understand, first of all, that historically there wasn't a category Semitism or Semites. That really comes out of linguistics in the 18th century, etc. But the point is, if you treat a group as illicit, in other words, they're not supposed to be there, they're not supposed to appear, then tagged on to Semites was the pathological. So although the term Semites before was referring to a variety of peoples, all the way through, by the way, to varieties of Ethiopians, but Arabs, the people, Hebrew-speaking people, etc., the term latched on to Jews specifically because the largest number of Semites within the European context were Jews. So the word anti-Semitism referred to Jew hatred. And one of the reasons I like to bring up the question, I prefer to say Jew hatred and to say it's a racism, is precisely because most of the people who ain't Jews don't know a damn thing about Jews. They don't know anything about Jewish religion. They don't know anything about Jewish history. They only know whatever's their Jews are supposedly the Jews. And this is something you'll find all over the place. If you look at some of the texts, for instance, in the 19th century, Arthur de Gobineau wrote a book, which is a kind of manifesto on racism called The Inequality of the Human Races. And when he talked about Jews, because he's really vitriolic on Blacks, he basically describes Jews as mulattoes, as a mixed race group. And he, in other words, he tries to have a biological reason for the inferiority of Jews. And this appeal is something that wasn't new to him. It goes all the way back, actually, to the period in Andalusia, the period under what we call when Christendom was under control of Moorish rule. And they had a term called reza. And reza refers, and today they say raza in Spanish, but it referred specifically to people who don't belong in the eyes of God. And those people were specifically Jews and Moors. And Moors were, as you know, Afro-Muslims. So already there was this embedded notion that there was something implicit internal to Jewish people, and at the time, Muslims, that would regard those peoples as intrinsically unnatural, outside of the eyes of God, etc. Now, the thing to bear in mind with this is that this leads to all kinds of stuff, right? For instance, one of the things I mentioned in a conversation some of us had talked about earlier is the first recorded Jew in the colonies was a rather funny story. It was a fellow by the name of Solomon who was arrested in New Hampshire. And he was arrested in New Hampshire in the colonies in the 16th century. And he was arrested for working on the Sabbath. And he had to explain that that's not his Sabbath, right? That he was Jewish. Now, the thing about it is he was arrested as a mulatto. And that gives you an idea already of that there was already a diversity of Jews in the colonies. But one of the things to bear in mind is that there are all kinds of things that come out, because as we know, we don't have enough time to get into details, but there were inquisitions, pogroms, all kinds of things that fundamentally, if you're going to say a group of people are outside the eyes of God, are unnatural, they don't belong, you're going to try to get rid of them. And so there has been a history of an absence of safety for Jewish people. There was a history of absence of safety for people who are Muslim in Christendom, but there is a larger Islamic world in which there were places of safety. And in fact, there were periods in which, for instance, Jews within those frameworks spoke Arabic, and many also went into the Islamic world. But at the same time, particularly to the Ottoman empires and others, there were complicated reasons where it was safer, but not necessarily safe. And this is very crucial because you see, the logic of safety is a bit of a lie to all peoples. Because the truth to be told, there's nowhere on this planet where everybody's safe. There are places where people could be safer, but nobody is ultimately safe. And countries that try to tell you they're going to make you safe are going to lie to you. And this is one of the tricky things, because you see, I put my cards on the table. I'm very critical of nation states. I consider nation states a danger because you can't construct a nation state without creating illegal people who don't belong. However, once nation states are there, the reality is nation states function as a kind of right or privilege within the contemporary international legal framework. So for people to be blocked from having a nation state also constructs them as inferior people. The danger that happens with any state, whether it's a nation state or a non-nation state, is if it slides from the privilege and rights of statehood into the category of license. License is when you can do anything you want without accountability. You see? And this is one of the tricky things, because there are people who will try to construct certain states as if they can be without impunity. And part of a legal framework is for people to be held accountable. So I'm quickly just going to make some remarks about what I call fallacies. You see? Because already I spelled out some of them. A fallacy is to think you're Jews or the Jews. The fallacy is to think Jews are white. Jews are many kinds. But even there's a double standard. If one wants to make it easier to hate Jews, it's easier to hate Jews if you want to have a binary colonial, anti-colonial, by making all Jews white to erase Jews like me. But at the same time, white supremacists, they hate Jews. And when those people were marching in Charlottesville, they were saying Jews will not replace us, which is ironic because the statue in which they were marching was built by a Jew. It was built by Moses Jacob Ezekiel, the statue of Jefferson. And a lot of those say because he was a Confederate Jew. So the irony of all things is white supremacists already lumped Jews into one category, when even internal to Jews, there's a full political spectrum and a full ethnic and varieties of spectrum. So here are some brief fallacies to think through that I hope will be helpful for everyone. First, we have to think about, we already talked about one of them, which is how we talk about people, right? People could have multiple identities, but belong to a community. So when I talk about anti-Jewishness as a racism, the error people make is they think if you are racialized, you must all look the same. The truth is you could racialize anybody. You could racialize any group and follow all the tenets of racism. Second, you have to think about the diversity of the Jewish people, but this means understanding that purity is one of the ways there's a form of violence done to Jewish people. The other one is migration without change. Jewish people are spread all over the place, and people expect Jewish people to be spread out without any change. That makes no sense. Next, there are many ways to talk about Jewish people without talking about gender. But the fact of the matter is, for a long period of human history, it was extraordinarily dangerous for women to travel. They would be enslaved. So the complexity of how Jewish communities were formed always mixed in with varieties of other communities. The other one is to avoid talking about colonialism. But the fact of the matter is, all the way through to the Hasmonean Empire, we call it the Hasmonean Empire, was linked through the question of Greek and other forms of colonialism, then Roman colonialism, there are the caliphates and so forth. Jewish history has always been a history of a struggle with of colonialism that ultimately creates an imposition about where Jewish people go. I exist because of the British Empire. It's just a reality. It threw Jews all over the place. The other thing we have to bear in mind, there are a lot more fallacies, but there are some things I want to say very quickly because of limited time. We need also to make a distinction when we talk about these issues, if we're going to have a productive conversation, about the distinction between conflict and war. Not all conflicts are war conflicts. I put it this way. I was talking to a student once and I said, look, you can have a conflict in which you're committed to coexistence. If you think of a marriage as an example, or a family, you can have conflicts, but at stake in the conflicts is how you can be stronger connected. That's a different kind of conflict, right? That's a conflict to coexistence. But war has enemies. The purpose of war is to win. And if you were to look at relationships, such as marriage or family or communities, etc., if the sole goal is winning, then it's simple, eliminate the other. The problem with the war model is you can win and be wrong. And the complicated issue that we face right now is to ask ourselves, what kind of future are we looking for as a species, as communities, etc.? The next ones I want to bring up very quickly is we have to understand the logic of slurs. And Scott brought up some of this, and it's connected to my point about racialize anybody. You could take any positive concept and turn it into a slur. Today, Zionism is used as a slur. It's used in such a way that it's like, have you stopped beating your wife? And you start defending yourself. But the reality is there have been many kinds. There was Black Zionism. Even in the movie The Matrix, they called the place of refuge Zion. It was a term for refuge. But right now, as a political tactic, to turn it into white supremacy and then to erase the diversity of Jewish people, subtextually, that is a move that is to issue a kind of trigger hatred of Jewish people. Now, the other one that's very complicated is how we talk about right and left and a lot of these areas. But what happens is we talk about right and left. The right historically has been a category around tradition, safety, order, and has been premised on the idea of singularity and purity. There's a lot of different issues in what's been called the left historically. But what we have is something very new today. We literally have now a right-wing left. And you may say, what the hell is that? Well, it is when the logic is not about coexistence, communication, and possibility, but boils down to a binary of simply whose side are you on, and construct other people as enemies. That leads to a logic against inclusion, and it radicalizes precarity. And so I close with this consideration, because you see, there's already a conflation when people say Israel and Jews, but at the same time, Israel's identity is a Jewish state. And as a nation Jewish state, when there are periods of global precarity, and right now all over the world, there are many examples as people turn to more authoritarian models, there will be an increase in the logic of focusing on a population that is considered illegitimate in its existence in the first place. And we're seeing increasingly the language, not simply of the question about accountability. Remember I said before, all nation states should be accountable. We've moved from the logic of accountability because, for instance, if apartheid is the concern, then unlike what happened in South Africa, where the project wasn't to get rid of the people, it was to get rid of a system of apartheid, but to have coexistence of the people. The problem right now is we're dealing with a language that's talking about the existence of a people. And that kind of a language is the language that ultimately comes down to a commitment against coexistence. And this is why I have characterized what we're seeing in the world right now as an increased situation of a right wing against a right wing, because both are locked in the logic of absolutes in which the only commitment is the eradication of the other.
Doc, thanks for that. And for everybody listening, when you get the recording, I want everybody to kind of come back and just kind of listen to this again. Everything that was kind of said through all the previous speakers. I'm gonna hit some other questions, and then we have a lot in the chat. Fortunately, the panels have been gracious enough that if we need to go a little bit over, they're willing to do that. So you guys are welcome to stay in terms of the audience as well. But we're gonna go ahead. I'm gonna ask a couple more quick questions. It's gonna be to everybody, and then we'll get into some of the questions in the chat. And based upon it, you guys have a lot to ask. When I look at some of the questions that were there in the chat. One thing I want to bring up, Doc, and actually I think Mr. Levin and Rabbi, you're welcome to jump in this as well. Let's have real talk now. All right, we've all seen the news, we see what's going on, and we're lawyers, most of us on this call. So I want to bring up the First Amendment. All right, there are protests on campuses across the nation, really across the globe, actually. In some of these academic places, we've seen resignations of high-profile people. There's a lot of controversy on that on both sides of that argument. There's a lot of debate within the classes amongst students about what can be said. Our Palestinian brothers and sisters kind of, would argue, look, we should be able to speak what we want. It's a free country. We're Americans, just like you say it is, as Jewish community is, and the same thing from Jewish community, who are saying, yes, you can speak, but there might be limits on what you can say and how to do that. So I pose to you all, where is that line? We're in a country of the First Amendment. As a retired Army officer, I fought for those rights. So I just want to find out kind of where's that line? What would you say to people who are saying, hey, I have a right to protest, But then the others were saying you do have a right to protest, but there's also a place where it goes beyond what should be protected or what protest is. So I'll open up the floor.
I guess I can kick off a response. I think we have to recognize the nature of the First Amendment, first of all, which is that government is not going to restrict speech. And we should ensure that it does not do so. I think most of us understand that in the United States, hate speech is protected. People can say the most ugly, awful things that are out there about someone's race, about their religion, about deeply held beliefs, whatever they want to. But that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences that occur. If someone were to use the N-word, if someone were to use, as relates to Jews, one of the epithets that starts with K, for instance, or some of those things, they have a legal right to do those types of things. It doesn't mean, though, that they don't have consequences, that people are going to respond and indicate when they disagree from that happening.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Sure. I mean, look, there's several things. I've been in a lot of battles, particularly with the American right on these issues, because I mean, I've gone through everything from attacks that led to, my mail have to be checked for plastic bombs, to 500 hate mails with the N-word a day, and on and on and on. But the basic rule is very straightforward. One, what Scott said is absolutely correct, that the First Amendment is really about how about a restriction on the government's ability to restrict speech. However, within the private realm, we do know that there is also an impact on speech that can be demonstrated to lead to direct harm. In other words, it's never been that it's absolute. There's a good example is, I remember when 9/11, right? Before 9/11 happened, I was in a very big conflict around speech issues. And I just said in response that a lot of the people who are claiming they defend speech are failing to understand that it's not an absolute right. I said, if the United States were under attack, look what will happen to your free speech very quickly. And I was saying that in March, right, 2001, and then September occurred. And we saw how free speech was just walked all over. So one of the things, I have a colleague by the name of Lynn Terrell. She's done wonderful work on this. She has written a piece called Toxic Speech. And that's something very different, because she has studied speech in Rwanda. She studied speech in almost every context in which there was genocide. And one of the things we know is that speech, it's very striking, isn't it? You ever notice people could be friends, but the moment they begin to create a distance, a friend starts to refer to the other friend by the last name. Suddenly, instead of being Bill or Mary, now, well, Mr. Smith or Ms. Smith, before you know it, then there's a pejorative term. Before you know it, if it's women and women, the B word or whatever word or the N word, and the things go off and they're ready to throw down. One of the things we have to take seriously is that words are never just words. Words are also how we establish our relations or non-relationships with others. And it's striking, if you think about even lynchings, all right, you're going to lynch me. Why are you going to call me all these names along the way? Well, part of it is to create a sufficient distance to dehumanize the other person. It's to put you in a position to make the violence okay. And so within this framework, I think it's absolutely legitimate for us to take heed of how words are being used and to look at the kinds of words that are being used for the purpose of eliciting a form of response that will be the elimination, in other words, the construction of enemies and the eradication of others. And that's something that works its way through courts, but it's not absolute. Speech isn't absolute. There are restrictions, but we should bear in mind that the way they work within the realm of private individuals to private individuals are in the realms of other areas of laws like torts and things. There's a reason we have libel and things like that. In other words, harm.
Okay. Let me ask you this. This right now, you've had the statistics and you've seen, we've seen the increase in anti-Semitism. And this is where my bias comes in. As a Black man, I'll be honest, and I don't want to speak for all Black people, but I'm going to say what I know some of them are thinking. They're sitting there saying, well, okay, we hear the Jewish community, saying that anti-Semitism is on the rise, that all these horrible things are happening to the community, and they're all true. I see them here in my community as well. But we as Black people, or even throw the Palestinians in there, we face stuff for thousands of years as well as hundreds of years. We've had slavery, we've had this and had that. What's your perspective on that? And I know you actually mentioned something when we had an early talk, Doc, and you can talk about it, but I open up to everybody. Is that a futile thing to do, to kind of compare the horrifics that we've all faced, or what do you guys think about that?
I'd like to start us off on this. Such an important question. Because I think that we make a mistake, we humans, if we either want to do a comparing, my suffering's worse than your suffering, my people's suffering's worse than your people's suffering. It's a mistake and not helpful. One is that it's not a zero-sum game, for one thing. And the other is that I think that our healing as a collective really depends on our capacity to honor and listen to and be interested in and curious about and feel pain for the other's suffering. I think that is so essential. And so I see this discussion as an opening to conversation, not to say, let's only look at the Jewish people's pain and trauma and suffering and hatred towards Jewish people. Yes, it is essential. And yes, I hope and pray that all those who are listening, hear that and hear the pain behind the statistics, but not in any way to say anyone else's suffering or any other oppression against other people's is less than or doesn't matter. That it absolutely does, and that I think that we are ultimately in this together, and that I think that Dr. Gordon mentioned something in his comment on outside the eyes of God, that my ability and capacity to listen to your pain and suffering and your ability and capacity to hear mine, that is where the healing will come.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
If I could, so quickly, and then I think Dr. Gordon will give us the real answer. I wanted to really just recognize a couple things. First of all, at the Anti-Defamation League, as Nicole had said, we have a mission that's both to confront anti-Semitism and to secure justice for all. So I think we've been recognizing that in America, unless hate against any one group is going to affect other groups, and I think that's certainly been proven. But what I would challenge in that question, Mr. Boston, is the question of if you've had prior conversations in this realm of diversity and equity where you've addressed race, let's say, for instance, did someone ask those speakers whether or not they should be speaking out on anti-Semitism? I doubt that took place. So I think one of the issues that's happening today and what we're seeing of late that's going on is that anti-Semitism has not been recognized always as being a fully baked target, let us say, in these areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-hateful type things that are going on. So the struggle I have with the question a little bit is that I think in looking at anti-Semitism, it does stand on its own. That being said, there is no question in my mind that in order for our society to get better and to address anti-Semitism, racism, anti-LGBTQ, whatever those hatred forms are that are out there, we really need to make sure that we're working on all people. That's one of the reasons why we have anti-bias education programs that aren't just focused on anti-Semitism, because we know that it's really an ecosystem that this country is in, that we have to really work on hate against all people. But I'm sure Dr. Gordon has thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, there's several things. The first thing is to bear in mind that a similar to or a shared condition is not identical with the same. And discrimination is discrimination, but there's a specificity to different kinds of discrimination. For instance, there's a way in which one discriminates against a woman that's very different than the way one discriminates against a man. But there are men who receive discrimination, nevertheless. Now, the tricky part is that we're in a period right now of a kind of attack on the very idea of political solutions, and that tends to substitute them with moralism. And the problem with moralism is that moralism seeks a kind of purity. And within that purity, it means that people begin to vie for who is the best exemplar of victimization. In other words, it becomes illegitimate to say I was harmed. One has to say I was the most harmed. And within that framework, increasingly as a bidding for political recognition is done through harm, then there becomes a competition of harm. Now, it's very straightforward that the legitimacy of one's case of being harmed, it should be sufficient. It shouldn't have to be that one is the absolute most. And in different contexts, different things would apply. So if we were to come back to this question, look, when I'm at Pesach, when I'm at a Seder, I'm a Black Jew. And there's a certain point where we talk about slavery and other things. And I don't talk about enslavement as remote. But that doesn't mean that the connection is illegitimate. It gets even more tricky because, again, people would presume, but again, I'm Black. But it turns out my enslaved ancestors turn out to have been my Chinese and Tamil Indian ones, because my Black side is from Liberia, and I said Palestine and Ethiopia. You see where I'm going with this? But here's the point. That would not abdicate in any way my connection to the understanding of anti-Black racism, on which I've written a great deal, and which I experience, because when a person hates me as a Black man, they're not saying that I, Lewis Gordon, am a specific descendant of a Black enslaved person. And similarly, when someone hates someone as a Jew, they aren't thinking in their head, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Koshin, Kaifong. I know more. I work with 150 Jewish communities. I know more kinds of Jews than most people. They don't know that. So what we have to bear in mind is we should be able to do the equivalent of chewing gum and walking, which is we should have the ability to acknowledge a harm to a community and understand that does not in any way undermine the reality of the harm done to other communities, including our own. There are times when I face issues as a Jew. There are times I face issues as a Black. There are times I face issues as neither. I give you a very quick example. I often joke that sometimes I leave the United States. When I'm in Kennedy Airport, I'm a Black person. When I connect in one country, there was one country I connected in Abu Dhabi, and I sat next to a Tamil couple, and they smiled and they said, "Coming home for the holidays?" And then when I landed in Kerala, in Trivandrum, I went and the fellow looked at me and says, "Are you Arab?" I said, "Why do you ask?" He said, "No, I just want to know." But in each context, what I have to say to the audience is all are true, you see? And because I am all those people, all those identities, in different places, the logic is such that one could mean the difference of being alive the next day or not. And for instance, we had another member of the panel. There are lots of things. There are many people, the payhosts, there are a lot of things people don't recognize. Or I've dealt with people dealing with homophobia. I've seen LGBTQ anxieties around me where I face very great dangers. That's why I say you're not ultimately safe everywhere, because there's not one shoe size that fits all. The conditions may shift. The real question is the political commitment of creating a society in which people belong and can live and grow with dignity and respect. And so this is part of the story, not all of the story.
Thank you for that. And thank you for a shout out to our other panelists who was unfortunately able to make it, but he was going to be another dimension. We were going to add the LGBTQ community in the context of anti-Semitism, which was going to be phenomenal. Unfortunately, maybe we'll reschedule at some other point. The one last question I have, and then we're going to turn it over to everybody's questions in the panel. Let's look down the road a little bit. Right now, and I don't say this as a cliche or so, but let's say anti-Semitism is the hot topic right now, the hot button issue, because obviously what's happened October 7th and the increases that were occurring even before that, as many of you alluded to already. When I think about it, again, and I'll come from my bias, when I think about things like George Floyd, it was 2020, and how everybody at that time was talking about DEI, and we want to work together, we want to do all these things. I think about the Asian hate that's gone on. We saw that. That was kind of a hot button issue for a while. And then we come to the anti-Semitism. What I want to ask is, are you all concerned that either when this war in Israel ends, or a couple years down the road, that we're not back kind of in the same place in terms of, and this is my opinion, that we've, a lot of discussions, we've even had court cases that kind of have, and governments have kind of try to scrape away at DEI programs and so forth. And so are you concerned that, and one thing, what I think I'm hearing is that the Jewish community is kind of be recognized as a diverse group. And I just saw something that a bunch of Hollywood actors and actresses signed on to kind of have that included in their consideration, I think for the Grammys. I could be wrong on that, sorry about that. But I see this happening. Are you concerned that, 3 years, 4 years down the road, hopefully this war is way behind us, that we'll get complacent again? Or we're not talking about these issues like we should be, and we're just back to the status quo. Does anybody want to talk to that?
Well, I could start first so the others could have the last word on this one. I don't think we've ever, I think there are two we's here. There is the larger national conversation which has been uprooted as through social media and the complexity of technologies today, right? We're in a much smaller planet. There was a time when if you wanted to go from here to Europe or to the coasts of Africa, you're talking a few months. And there was even a time where if you're talking about going from here to parts of East Asia, you're talking about 3 years. Then it became rapid, right? You talk about a month, a few weeks. Now we live in a world where you could be there within 24 hours, anywhere on the planet, and we can communicate with one another in a nanosecond. When you can traverse space in a shorter amount of time, space shrinks. So the first thing is we live on a smaller planet. And we live on a smaller planet with 8 billion people. And within that framework, there are a lot, the extent to which things can, today's language is say go viral, but the main thing is there's an extent to which a lot of information can be sent in such a way that global discourse is affected. That doesn't mean throughout, and that there's not been always people not complacent. They've always, the fact that the ADL exists means that there were people who are not sitting down waiting for a moment when things would go wrong. We could talk about the NAACP. There are lots of others as well. There are lots of issues connected to the politics of this country. The historical, for instance, people love to talk about, I find scholars love to talk about the civil rights movement with Black-Jewish alliances. I hate the term Black and Jewish because I am Black and Jewish. But the point is, the liberal moment was the civil rights movement. But the truth is there have been more than 100 years of European Jews and African Americans who are not Jews in coalitions. But a lot of them were more radical left ones. There were Communist parties, socialist groups, unionist organizations, even the petition against the United States for genocide against Black people, which was done by William Patterson and others. That was done through a coalition of African Americans and European Jews. So it's not that, and even if we think about the fact that even this panel right now is an exemplification of the fact that people were not complacent. Because as we know, there's an extent to which the representation and the voices along gender and sexuality, that didn't come out of the blue. It wasn't that people woke up one day morally about it. It's because people fought for it. They were politically active about it. And they were doing it in every walks of life. So I would say right now, we are setting the conditions for others to be able to have a different kind of a struggle as they deal with these and other issues to come. We're only part of a story greater than ourselves. And this part is the anti-Semitic element. But there's a lot of stuff that we have to deal with. And I do think they are connected because we're talking about how we can have viable ways of trying to set the conditions, whether it's through law, economies, cultural conditions, and just downright even to conditions of faith for us to be able to say to one another that we belong. But my colleagues could take it from here.
Anybody?
Rabbi, do you have anything?
I'll add just a little bit. I think that social media definitely is not only speeds up, but puts at risk facts and truth and any underlying factual landscape that we can agree on, which I think is very, very dangerous for democracy. But I think also I do worry, and I don't know that I would say it's complacency, but a close relative of complacency of whether it's out of complacency or whether it's out of exhaustion. I think that there is the risk that we further silo into speaking only with those we agree with, listening to only those we agree with, really having a closed loop, which would be to our detriment and to democracy's detriment.
And I would just thank you both. I just would add a little bit, I think, to your question, Mr. Boston, is also, there are these moments in our history where there is great attention that's brought to things. And as you noted in the post-George Floyd era, how that the just growth of the DEI to where major law firms, governmental entities, businesses, corporations, all hired in universities, hired in people to be there. And today, what I fear is that it's all become politicized. Of course, like everything else in this country has become politicized, including anti-Semitism is being politicized, and Israel is being politicized, all these things, which is terrible. But to what I think was maybe your point is I do have a fear that at least right now, because of the attention that's being given to it, hopefully it's a moment of inflection and therefore a moment of education. But unfortunately, what we have found, I think both those of us that are Jewish as well as those of us that are people of color or other targeted communities, is that this is a long, long battle that we're involved with, and no point of inflection is going to change it. I'm often asked, working for an organization that's been around since 1913, in that same era when the NAACP, the Urban League, ADL, they were all created for various reasons why that time was so important. But, we haven't gotten it right yet. And I guess I can say as a 45-year-long attorney, as we often joke, we call it a practice because we're never done. We're practicing to do it. In the Jewish tradition, for those of you that aren't Jewish, there's a wonderful quote that one of our sages, Rabbi Tarfon, said that, it's not our job to finish the task, but neither can we desist from it. And that is, I think, what perpetuates my colleagues on the panel and myself to even be involved in these areas is I don't think in any of our lifetimes we're going to be able to stop this, whether or not the DEI continues on or some of these other kinds of issues. We're still going to be caught in this battle.
Thank
So
you.
To pick up on what you just said, and to take 2 minutes to wrap up, maybe 30 seconds from each panelist before we get to the questions. This series is called Activate Diversity, and we don't want to just talk about diversity, but we want to give the people tuning in ways that they can help promote diversity and to, in the context of this particular discussion, fight against anti-Semitism. So what would you, if you could say one thing to do to try and fight anti-Semitism that audience members could do, what would that be?
Well, for me, it's hard to get it down to one thing, but I think what I am propelled by in my life is that I know anti-Semitism is not going to be defeated unless I have allies. I'm not going to, on my own, be able to change it. Hate of any kind is hate against anyone, is hate against all people. And I recognize, and my entire life is built on the belief that in order to have allies, I have to be an ally. So I think that's the action item I would give for people. We're built on connections that we have with one another, and we're getting away from those personal connections that we have. I need to stand up for my brothers and sisters of every stripe, color, and kind, and that includes religious diversity, and work very, very hard at that as well, because I want them to be my allies.
I would offer be curious, engage in relationship building with urgency, but know that it's sometimes slow work of building that trust. And I think that all of us to hone our skills at deep listening with open heart and compassion is essential.
Earlier, when Rabbi Enger spoke, I was thinking about one of the things about the history of what led to what we call Judaism, and or I prefer even the question of Jewish ethics. You know, some people don't realize how much of it goes back all the way to some stuff very ancient in East Africa. And one of them was the very interesting thought by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. This is in the Middle Kingdom of ancient Kemet, which people now know as Egypt, but that's the Greek word for Kemet. And Akhenaten observed in Nefertiti that, you know, that which emanates life must be invisible, otherwise something would have emanated it. And this affected the idea that the flow of life, of all things that are supposed to be good, means that if you join it, you are part of something greater than yourself, but you yourself are not God. Now, this is something that I think is very important, because you see, non-religious Jews and religious Jews share this understanding that it's really bad to think you're God, to take on the view of a kind of inflated sense of self that gets in the way. And I say this because some of the things I do love, not like love, when I think about Jewish thought or ethics is I love the concept of taking responsibility for ethical life. And for me, one of the most concrete examples of it, I always almost get it, I have to hold myself back when I witness someone becoming a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. Because the child, a 12 or 13-year-old, is lifting up this heavy thing called Torah. And everybody's saying, don't drop it. And as they struggle with it and go around, I think it's one of the greatest allegories. It's not, this is the Jewish version, but every society I've studied have had some version of this allegory, which is that we have a responsibility for ethical life, for responsibility itself, and that to carry it will never be easy. It will be a burden. And in fact, if you go and you read not only the biblical text, but the commentaries on them, people think I hate the translation chosen people, because a lot of people don't understand what it means. Right? It doesn't mean you're better than other people. It means you're called upon to take on an enormous responsibility. And that's why if you look at a lot of the stories, the people who are called run away at first, because your life is going to be very difficult if you're called. Well, for those who are asking this question, as long as you're committed to that ethical responsibility, it's not going to be easy. But part of it is to understand the humility of what it is to take on a task greater than yourself. And that task means that you're willing to encounter others, not as an imposition, but as an opportunity of co-learning how to become better human beings. And I'll leave it at there.
Incredible. Thank you all. We're going to turn to these questions. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get through all of them. But I think Chisa Putnam is here, and she's going to read through and ask them the question you all have. I'll just say thank you now before I sign off. Incredible panel. Thank you so much for all you've done here. And let's get to the questions.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. And thank you, panelists. Jamie, I think you already hit on the social media. So one of the questions is, can you share examples of how Palestinian solidarity activists can engage in opposing Israelis' occupation of ancestral Palestinian land without being anti-Semitic?
Well, I think because we have a lot of questions, forgive me, members of the audience, a lot of these will be woefully too short. And part of this is because this is such an incendiary issue that people just lose it and they never get an answer to their satisfaction, okay? First, I think a lot of people need to learn about the actual history of Palestinian people. Second, a lot of people need to understand that there are Palestinian groups, including on the West Bank, who have been working to find a way to deal with the question. You see, it's the way we use the term ancestral, because you see, embedded in it is a presupposition that there's no Jewish ancestral claim. Now, all you have to do is go to the area. You will find thousands of years of artifacts that actually show Jewish ancestral claim. It's not, so the idea of defining it in such a way that it's impossible for Jewish membership, that's part of the problem. The coexistence part is to acknowledge that there were many groups, not exclusively Jews, not exclusively Arabs, not exclusively Christians at a certain point, not exclusively Muslims, but there are groups who are actually finding a way to bring a greater understanding of what it is for multiple people to belong. And there are Palestinian groups who do this. It's not exclusively as structured. There are groups, however, who reduce it to simply a war of just saying there is no legitimate Jewish claim whatsoever to living there. And once you're going to start from there, that's a no-go, mainly because that's not a coexistence kind of argument. But there are varieties. Trua is a group, for instance, that is involved in some of these issues. It's a group of rabbis who have been working to point out there's a way that you can actually support the idea of coexistence. But we should bear in mind that a lot of the problems we're seeing right now is not actually from the ground level people. It's from factions who have taken control, who are against coexistence. And so for them, it can be exclusively Jewish or exclusively non-Jewish Palestinians. There are people who are forgetting also that among Palestinians, there are people who identify as Palestinian who are Christian, non-religious. And as I mentioned in my autobiographical opening, there were people who were Jewish who identified as Palestinian Jews. So we need to bring a way of unlocking the reductionism of Palestinian identity exclusively to a version of Arab identity that's exclusively Muslim. But even among those who are Arab Muslims, there are those who have been working with varieties of groups for there to be a way of moving forward without it being reduced to the idea of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Dr.
I think that's actually the only thing that I would add to that. I do think, again, it's really important that advocating for the Palestinian cause or advocating against the policies of Israel is not in of itself anti-Semitic. So I don't have a problem with that. The problem in getting into this topic, as Dr. Gordon pointed out, is that it depends from what position the question is being asked in somewhat here. If it's in that maximalist position of that Israel is occupying the territory against which the Palestinians have, what territory and where? Are we talking about Gaza? Are we talking about the West Bank? Are we talking about all of Israel? These are very nuanced terms. And again, for those because this panel is about anti-Semitism, I'm not here to defend Israel one way or the other. It just happens to be the topic out of which a lot of anti-Semitism is arising. But I think we have to also know a little bit of that history that Rabbi Enger spoke about that was here. There was a mandate for two peoples with two lands that took place. One of the peoples accepted the land, one didn't. The area that's being fought over now in this conflict, was part of Egypt that we had, and then Egypt wouldn't take it back. Much of these disputed areas that are there, for which I think history has shown Israel wanted to reach full and final agreements following conflicts that have taken place. There was no one that would do that at that time. And that's not, again, to say that Israel has completely clean hands or that you need to adopt everything that Israel has done, and otherwise you're going to be anti-Semitic. You can challenge all of those things, but I think that you have to understand where you're coming from and the language that you're using there.
And I'll add just a little bit that up until October 7th, there were a number of Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian groups that were working, closely together and doing the hard work of building trust and dialogue to move towards coexistence. One of the great and many tragedies of October 7th was that really broke down those relationships in many ways. And also, tragically, a number of the people who were murdered on October 7th in Israel were some of the strongest advocates for a two-state solution and working towards peace with people in Gaza. But I think that there are ways of helping to support the work of on the ground in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank of people who are working hard and to reestablish that trust.
One thing, I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing very quickly. Another thing too is when I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks how people talk about Blacks and how many groups talk about Jews, we're talking about two groups in which almost everybody has an opinion and very few people have a lot of knowledge. And it's a similar thing when people right now even talk about Israel, there are certain realities that people are not putting into the equation. Because you see, when Israel was founded, the largest populations of people who migrated to Israel, Jews who migrated, were from Arab countries. And these were Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews. And because their experience is of expulsion, they tend to take the position that, among many of them, that the more Arab nationalist end of Palestinian groups would be a threat because they were expelled from Arab territories. I mention this because that's the group who basically supported the individuals under the Netanyahu government who are in. A lot of people look at white settlers moving to West Bank, but what they don't realize that you have a greater probability in Israel if you're dealing with, to have a person who is more progressive, if we use that language, on Palestinian issues, ironically, if they are what we call white, than the ones if we call color. And so it flips it over, but that's erased in the discourse to construct Israel as an exclusively white supremacist area with white settlers, because it erases the history of the question of how Arab Jews regard Arab lands. And these are conversations that, because these Jews are also Arabic speaking, that are happening at ground levels. But I think it's important for many of you who are listening in to understand that, again, sometimes we stereotype people in such a way that we say the whites have to be the racists or the whites have to be the hating, but sometimes in some situations, that might be the site of the more progressive location. And those are the ones, if you look at the protests in the streets that were going against the Netanyahu government, they were overwhelmingly the lighter Israeli population, not the darker. And that really makes it a more complicated political issue than many of us outside think when we think about concepts like occupation, etc. Anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Another question we have, how can one be critical in language without being anti-Semitic? And another part of that question is, how does the reason for the Jewish homeland compare to the Western Hemisphere, I think it should be Western Hemisphere Indigenous Peoples land back movement?
Well, again, we get into a dispute of who are the indigenous people of Israel. Judaism has been around for 3,000 or more years, as the rabbi pointed out. Islam, not as long, clearly, but there are at this point in time, when we have millennia involved, I'm not sure that it ultimately is going to make a difference when you have two people who have two narratives and two ties to the land. So, we look at what modern history was and who was there. And what I always love to go back to what Mark Twain said in the late 1800s when he was traveling through what he called the Holy Land, and he made light of the fact that this was not really the land of milk and honey. It was occupied by a few settlements of old Jews and some nomadic Arab people that were living there. So all of that is very complicated into who is indigenous. I think, though, to the question about anti-Semitism, and again, I think we have to meet the moment, and the moment is what's happening in the conflict with Israel and Hamas, and how this is impacting in very terrible ways the Palestinian people and the Jewish people that are there on this land that's going on. But anti-Semitism is much, much greater than Israel. that's going on. And I don't want people to lose sight of that fact. Right now, that might be what's generating some conversations. But again, I remind you that on October 6th, we were already running at extraordinarily high rates of anti-Semitic incidents that had nothing to do with Israel. And so I just caution people that wrapping these two things together as if the conflict were to end, or if all of a sudden someone could wave the magic wand and everybody would be happy with the solution there. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to end anti-Semitism.
Yeah, two things I'd add to that. In my research and writings and also community work around what's called indigenous issues, and I do it globally, not just in North America, but in Oceania, all the way through South America, many places. You know that when I talked about fallacies earlier, remember I mentioned purity as one of the fallacies? There's this ridiculous notion when we talk about indigenous peoples as if there is a pure people who just proud of the earth from someplace. And that's just never been historically so. Human beings have always been meeting one another, mixing in, et cetera, just throughout history. And so what it is that people develop identities with places and live in those places. And even right now, when I'm teaching with Native American thought, for instance, if we're talking about the different groups in Central America, North America, and so forth, again, there are many ways in which not only do they mix through, but the complex understanding of their humanity is such that the relevant issue becomes, is there a place where multiple groups of people call home? And the idea that if we're going to get like a blood test and so forth, even though today we can do genetics and so forth, it's very funny. My daughter went and did one of these genetics things. It was funny. She was disappointed because everything I told her about her ancestry was true. And it even showed up all, big clunk of it in right smack in what is today's Palestine. So that gives you an understanding, okay? That Israel, I'm thinking, yeah, my mother, anyway, a lot, right? That's the one part. But the second part, which is, I think, what Scott is saying, that's very crucial to bear in mind, is that when we're talking about bigotry and hatred, there's always too many members of the hated group. Jews are a tiny population everywhere in terms of proportion, except Israel. But you hear constantly in the United States, there are too many Jews around. When we think about it at the level of race, right, the anti-affirmative action stuff, there's always a complaint that there are too many blacks. If I list the number of places in which I'm the first black, and I'm the first, if we count even their contexts in which I'm the first Jew, or I'm the first person of Asian descent, etc. But the point is, as long as the view is you don't belong, there will always be too many of you, okay? And it's not just around race and ethnic groups. I could tell you the work I've done on gender and sexuality, that, there are forums in which there was such blatant commitment to making sure women don't belong. And so any woman there is too many. And so if we're dealing with it, the fact of the matter is exactly what Scott said. We're talking about it at this moment because of a global thing with Israel. But the issues that Scott and many of us have been talking about, there's a reason that I have more than 30 years of writings on these issues that deal with anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, because we're talking about, and my work also on LGBTQ and gender issues, precisely because we're talking about the question of an antipathy, an antipathetic attitude towards certain people belonging.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. And our final question, and just a disclaimer, we had about 21 questions, so we were not able to get through all of the questions this evening, but we do appreciate everyone submitting questions or those who were able to submit questions. But just in the interest of time, we're not able to go through all of the questions this evening. The last question that we will address will be, Does the panel think Israel's heavy-handed response in killing so many innocent Palestinians is undermining their support? What is the panel's response on that?
Well, I mean, I could speak first so the others could speak last. You know that point I said before about accountability, okay? Of course, there's no way people are going to look at 21,000 people. I don't know if the number is now 23,000 people dead, that they're not going to say, was that necessary? And one of the things that's complicated here is that, remember when I said a right wing versus a right wing? It's pretty clear that if Hamas had the capacity to have killed far more than they had, they would do it. And the fact of the matter is, there are people for whom that tragedy, the tragedy of what happened in early October, there are people for whom within the Israeli government, given their historical position, instead of a tragedy, it's an opportunity. And so the reality is that given the history of that group, I'm not talking about Israeli people, I'm talking about that particular governing body, the retaliation and other issues, there is always going to be a way, as forensics and other ways of looking through, that accountability will be met. And of course, many people look at things in numbers, but you know, ultimately, the mother, the brother, the sister, the friend, anybody who is losing their relatives in Gaza are going through what the mother, the brother, the sister, anybody who lost loved ones in the kibbutz, in the other areas in southern Israel were going through. In the end, we could conflate the numbers all we'd like. What we're struggling for at the moment is the humanity of the people in the midst of this. And what I'm concerned about is an extent to which, in the pressure for people to say it's just one side versus the other, there's a distance that's and a refusal to acknowledge the humanity of the others. There are people who do not want to hear about the humanity of the people who died in early October, and there are people who do not want to hear about the humanity of the people who are dying in Gaza. And so this is going to be a larger issue. And then there's a larger, and I'll be done. And there's a larger, more complicated political issue that we have to deal with, which is to what extent our global legal system is in such a way that accountability is left exclusively to those who lose wars, not those who win them. And I do think part of what Scott was saying earlier is something people don't listen to, because there were in these wars, Israel has won those wars, and there is a division among Israelis, because there are those who are saying, look, what Israel should have just said, we won, take it, everybody out, end of story. But the history has been trying to find a way to have Palestinian land there. And so, and the question is going to be to make sure that that effort at least is not erased. But yes, there's no way when we look, especially with the way we have access to an ongoing stream of violence, degradation, all of that, that in any way the current Israeli government can look good. There's no way. And that's just a reality. But if we're dealing with the larger anti-Semitism issue, we have to understand this as not exclusively a Jewish responsibility. The ultimate radical question is going to be humanity's responsibility. And I don't think it's as simply answered by simply the way people are talking about ceasefires, if there's a commitment to an ongoing eradication of the people in Israel.
I'm going to jump in, and then Scott, you get the last word here. Thank you, Dr. Gordon, kind of adding to a couple of the things that you offered. I think one, the current suffering of the people in Gaza is horrific, no question. I would ask that we all give thought, though, with any other country in the world, if terrorists came in through tunnels, toppling down borders, killed 1,200 people in a day, took 200 people hostage, where more than 100 still remain hostage, would the world be condemning that sovereign country for striking back? I don't think so. So that's the double standard that I think that we wrestle with. The other thing I want to put out there, how the question was framed is so that question is Israel being heavy-handed? Yes, the death of so many Palestinians is terrible. But would heavy-handed be the term used if any other sovereign state struck back after a terrible massacre on its property and the taking of 200 hostages? I don't think so. The other thought to put out there is that throughout the world, here in the United States as well, before Israel struck back militarily at all, people were out protesting pro-Hamas, which is really telling, that outside the Sydney, Australia Opera House, people were yelling, "Gas the Jews." So here's where there is a line that's crossed, both on a double standard, but also a question of, where is there the conflating of challenges to Israel's military authority to anti-Semitism.
And I think I concur completely, but the only last couple things I would offer is, I think we have to also remember that Hamas's attack on October 7th was with full intent to perpetuate a conflict and a war. And it was not to reach an immediate conclusion, because that's just, it's not even realistic for that to do it. From a Jewish perspective, and I think also from the Israeli perspective, when this takes place, Hamas, to a certain extent, can be viewed as winning, because they either make military advances that are wins, or they cause Israel to fire back. And we've seen this in several other conflicts. It's just this one is so much more concentrated. And yes, it is terribly humanitarian, from a humanitarian or moral perspective, as a human, to see so many people dying. But I think the last thing that I would leave as a comment is, and this is part of the double standard that I think all three of us in different ways have referred to that's gone on. I would just ask if the people that are now pointing to whatever the number is, and again, I want to remind people whether the number's 21, 23,000, that the health ministry does not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. It doesn't, and when it talks about children, it doesn't distinguish between those that are carrying rifles and those that aren't. But whatever it is, it's too much death that's out there. But whatever that number is were these same people concerned in Syria when there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people that had been killed by what had gone on? Were they complaining with what the Houthis did, the Yazidi, in Yemen, in all of these other places? And it's not to justify what Israel may or may not be doing right or wrong that's there, but it does often feel as a double standard that's gone on, that we hold Israel to a standard that, quite frankly, we don't hold the United States of America to on so many levels that's out there. And that's why I think that right now, Jews in particular are feeling vulnerable. And again, I just want to make one tiny thing clear, because I know it was questions that were asked, and I wanted to clarify. No, I don't believe that every kid on every college campus that's out there chanting Free Palestine, even Palestine from the river to the sea, actually is calling for the genocide of the Jewish people. I don't. Some are calling for that removal that's out there. I think our job, again, I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning, is to make sure that people understand that words matter and that we need to explain to them what they're saying. And if they still don't change what they're saying, then yes, eventually I am going to have to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Thank you, Rabbi Enger. Let's see, for our moderators, do our moderators have any closing thoughts or remarks before we wrap up?
Nicole, I'll let you go. You want to go first? Do you have anything?
You know, I think we've gone past our time, so I will leave it with the panelists for the last word.
Actually, let me squeeze in 1 second. And I'm basing this because I'm seeing some of the chat. And one, we're not going to answer this question today, and I hope nobody had an expectation that we would. And I do think what we should walk away, and I appreciate what Mr. Levin just said at the end here, with words mattering. I think we do have to, even with the word double standard, have to look at that a little bit. And I say that as a retired military man. I can say that there were plenty of times that, you know, American soldiers were accused of doing too much, so to speak, and we're going too far. So I do think there's historic things. I mean, you think about the bomb being dropped in Hiroshima and all. Now, granted, there's context to all that, and so we don't want to lose that. But I think the bigger point for us to take home was one of the earlier things said, that, you know, this is not a time to compare tragedies. Loss of life is loss of life. And that's what we need to be thinking about. And I think the biggest point, I think, came from the rabbi about, I think it was the rabbi, humanity. I think that's where we have to start focusing our efforts on, is what is humanity involved with that? So whether you're losing 1 life or 2 million lives, that's still a life lived. And I think Dr. Gordon was saying about both families are going through that tragedy of loss. And so it's probably counterproductive, as we've kind of talked about comparing, but what are we going to do? And it goes back to our title about activate diversity. And I think building those allies and having these type of conversations, as comfortable they are, as much as we might be disagreeable, because I know some people are probably walking away not in the same mindset or agreeable with what's been said. And by no means do I think these panels represent all the views. These are 3 panels that we have, but I think they have laid out things for us to chew on. And I think that's the point of this whole discussion series. Think about what's being said. And that's why I encourage you to go back and listen to this later on. The knowledge that's come from all 3 of these panelists, I appreciate. And I think we need to do that, or develop ourselves, challenge ourselves. Because I've learned so much in this time frame talking to these people. I've had to re-examine. I hope we all re-examine how we thought about things before today and how we think about things later on down the road. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And thank you to our guests who have stayed on here with us. I know we've gone over time, but I think it's a very valuable conversation, as well as many others. And hopefully you follow us up with other conversations we have. But thank you so much. And to all the questions were asked, we are going to try, I can't promise, but we know there's a lot more questions out there. We're going to try to write them down and send them to the panelists. And if they feel they are welcome to answer those questions. So some of the questions we didn't get to answer, hopefully you'll get written answers later on, but we're going to leave that to them. So if you don't get an answer, I'm sorry, but we are going to try to at least address those. So again, thank you so much to everybody involved. And I'll turn it back over to Chief, I believe.
Thank you, Jamie. And again, we want to, on behalf of the Diversity Committee, Diversity Board, we would like to thank Mr. Scott Levin, Dr. Lewis Gordon, Rabbi Cindy Enger. Thank you so much for serving as panelists for us this evening. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your knowledge, your expertise. We would like to thank our chair, Mr. Henry Hamilton, for doing our introduction for our program and our moderator introduction. We thank our awesome moderators, Nicole and Jamie. We appreciate you this evening. Thank you so much. And we thank our program participants, those who signed up to take in this knowledge this evening, to hopefully you're on the path to activating diversity, because that's the purpose of these programs, to not only gain the knowledge, but to actually put it into play. The title of this program, Activate Diversity, Unity in Diversity, Challenging Anti-Semitism Through Dialogue. We hope that you were able to take something from this dialogue and again, go forward and activate diversity. This is one of many programs, so just be on the lookout for our next program. It's still in the works, but we appreciate your time and we look forward to having you participate in future programs. So all have a good evening. And again, thank you.